that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Khrushchev decided to send missiles there at the diplomatic signal. Don't invade Cuba, we are serious.
But without any hesitation, because we were being harassed.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. The struggle for power. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day conflict that took place in 1962. This almost led to nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, then escalated the tension within countries in the Cold War. Years later, it has led to the nuclear regulations we have in place around the world. Background. Cuban Missile Crisis was an event that took place in 1962 that almost led to nuclear war. The event was important because it was one of the first threats of nuclear missiles in almost 17 years since the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, which took place in World War II. The missile crisis took place between the Soviet Union and United States during the Cold War, which was a war with no weapons, yet tensions were at an all-time high. The two countries were both competing within one another as world powers in order to gain the recognition of winning the space and arms race. In pursuit of power, this rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union created an environment where crisis was imminent. This is what led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place. When the United States placed missiles in Turkey as an aggressive maneuver to gain a striking advantage, the Soviet Union retaliated by placing missiles in Cuba. Build up. The placing of missiles in Turkey by the United States advanced the issue to the point where the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, essentially starting the Cuban Missile Crisis. When U-2 fighters located the Soviet missiles, the 13-day crisis started abruptly. The range of the missiles depended on the type of the missile, with the SS-4 reaching a top of 2,500 kilometers and the SS-5 reaching up to 5,000 kilometers. Even though the news was booming during this time, with newspapers written every other day, no one but the president and his advisors knew about the crisis until day 7, when President Kennedy addressed the nation. Newspapers during this time were important because they captured the exact time and date of the event. Television was in its infancy, and there was no social media at the time, so news traveled slowly, and much of the country was unaware that this was the biggest news event since World War II. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was trying to overthrow Castro, who was trying to diminish the effect Americans had on Cuba. This caused the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion of Cuba by the United States that took place in 1961, which ultimately failed. This was an attempt to show China and Russia that the United States was set on winning the Cold War. As a result, though, Castro saw a political relationship with the Soviet Union as a source of strength against the United States, which resulted in the movement of missiles to Cuba by the Soviet Union. Day 1. U-2 fighters found evidence of missile sites in Cuba. This was the start of the 13-day conflict. There were immediate ideas of how to stop them, like to quarantine or invade, but the consequences could be dire. Day 2. Suspicions were confirmed when they found evidence of 16 to 32 missiles in Cuba. Day 3. On this day, it brought the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, who met and told Kennedy that the moving of missiles to Cuba was purely defensive aid. Not accepting this hypothesis, Kennedy replied by stating that if weapons were found in Cuba, there would be grave consequences. Day 5. On this day, it brought hours of intense discussion where President Kennedy and his advisors weighed the decision on whether to quarantine or invade Cuba. The meeting ended with the conclusion that the only way an airstrike would be effective is if we completely destroyed all the missiles during the initial airstrike. Day 6. The President meets with the General of the Air Force, who informs the President and his advisors that an airstrike would not involve 100% destruction of the missiles. The realization that an airstrike may not be completely effective drove the decision to quarantine rather than invade due to the potential risks. Day 7. On this day, the President is starting to involve other countries and presidents, informing them of the issue. John F. Kennedy also informs the nation at this time about what is happening. This also brought the United States to disclose the locations of the known nuclear bunkers.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Day 8. The President sends a letter to the Soviet Union pleading them to remove the missiles before military action is required. In addition, Kennedy officially enacts the naval quarantine around the perimeters of Cuba. This is important because of the first action taken by either side, and retaliation measures by Cuba and the Soviet Union could have followed at any time. Day 9. The Soviet Union replies to the United States request sent on Day 8. Khrushchev said that the United States is trying to intimidate them into submission. Day 10. Kennedy pleads in a letter to again remove the missiles since some were now functional. Meanwhile, in the United Nations, the Soviet Union and the United States both made their cases regarding their actions. The United States ambassador, being more aggressive, showed detailed photographs of the missiles. Day 11. Both sides start to agree on a conclusion to the current situation, with the United States to remove quarantine from Cuba and commit not to invade Cuba. If these commitments were followed, the Soviets would remove all missiles from Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union. Day 12. On this day, a U-2 American fighter pilot is shot down making routine checks over Cuba. He is then awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by John F. Kennedy himself. The Soviet Union also demands the removal of all missiles from Turkey. In the meeting with John F. Kennedy and his advisors, Kennedy stated that the removal of missiles in Turkey would have to be part of the overall deal. Kennedy's advisors did not agree, so Kennedy decided to meet with the ambassador of the Soviet Union in secret. Kennedy was able to negotiate a compromise which finally brought a conclusion to the missile crisis, with the Soviet removal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for removing the quarantine of Cuba and removal of missiles from Turkey. Day 13. This brought an end to the missile crisis with an announcement to the public that the conflict had been averted. This brought an end to the missile crisis with the removal of all weapons and missiles from Cuba. But this was a day of peace and remembrance, bringing no wars, but left rather a bomb-sized crater in the tension of the Cold War. Short term. The biggest short-term impact was the fact that the Soviet Union did not like what Khrushchev did, so there was an uproar of power in 1964, which caused a military buildup. This was important because it decreased relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. The other short-term impact is they both agreed to stop nuclear testing above ground in 1963, which was important because it resulted in stronger guidelines regarding the use of nuclear missiles.
But too often these meetings have produced only darkness, discord, or disillusion. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. For the first time, an agreement has been reached on bringing the forces of nuclear destruction under international control.
Long-term. A long-term impact was that the tension of the Cold War increased because the Soviet Union was determined to not be pushed around again, leaving the Soviet Union to try to catch up in the arms and space race. This also has led to the nuclear regulations around the world today, which is probably the biggest positive impact that the Cuban Missile Crisis had on modern-day society. Although, we are facing a similar problem with North Korea, but we are better equipped and have a better understanding of how to deal with the potential consequences, having averted a conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Conclusion. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a scary 13-day event that almost led to nuclear war. This led to one of the most important events in history. The crazy fact is that almost no one knows much about the event or how close they were to being nuclear bombed. The short-term and long-term impacts were very massive. The event itself will go down in history forever. The impacts were helpful because it helped increase relationships between the United States and Russia. This is important because the efficiency in which we can now communicate is huge and leaves the ability to resolve conflicts quicker and more safely. Even though we may not realize it, the missile crisis may have had more of an effect than originally thought.